And we are live. Good evening on this cold night once again. And I want to look at something post Shavuot. I had a couple of requests to deal with this subject, which is a little bit on the technical side, and we're going to try to make it come alive and as understandable as possible, as logical as possible. And that is the hermeneutical principles of the Torah. That's a very big word. And I'm going to make that word much less scary. So what does hermeneutics mean? Well, in Hebrew, there's a word that you're probably far more familiar with called drash. Drash is one of four ways in which Torah is expounded upon, is explained. There is what we call pshat, which is the literal interpretation. The remez, which is the illusions contained in the Torah. There's drash, which is hermeneutics. I'll come back to it. And there's sod, which is secrets, the hidden parts of the Torah. And these four dimensions of Torah together spell out the word paradise, which means the orchard. So it's a matter of kind of perusing of the fruits of the orchard of Torah, the paradise of Torah. Now, what is hermeneutics? So, drash is probably very closely related to a word you know well, which is a drosha. A drosha is something that the Rabbi will give on Friday night or Shabbos morning, where you take a point of Torah and expound on it and take it out of its literal direct meaning to a more indirect interpretation. And that's a very important aspect of Torah. And Torah law also works that way. So let's backtrack. We're coming from Shavuot, when we marked the gift of Torah. Shavuot is when Hashem revealed himself on Mount Sinai, and he gave over the laws of the Torah to the Jewish people. He gave it over in the form of the Ten Commandments. And then that was followed by Moshe going up on Mount Sinai, and Moshe on Mount Sinai received the rest of the mitzvot of the Torah, all 613. But beyond the text of the written law as we know it, Moshe also received alongside it the oral law. And we've touched on that before. The laws of the Torah, when taken literally, are not always the correct interpretation of the Torah. So there was a text, and then there was an interpretation, the commentary that went with it that explained it. Example, most classical example, is if you read in the Shema, it talks about where you have to put your tefillin. It talks about placing your tefillin le bein einecha. Bein einecha literally means between your eyes. That would be putting them here. But we all know that's not where it goes. It goes there. How do we get from here to there? Oral law, interpretation, but an interpretation which was handed to Moshe on Mount Sinai when Hashem said the words. Bein einecha, he says, and by the way, between your eyes means here. When he says al yadcha, on your hand, he also explained it doesn't mean that you put the tefillin on the palm of your hand, but rather here on your arm. So that was the interpretation or the oral law that came along with the written text. The written text clearly says, "Kshatem leot bein al yadcha." So literally that would be on your hand as well as on between your eyes. There is an interpretation. So when we celebrated Shavuot, we rejoiced over the gift of Torah. We actually rejoiced over the gift of a dual Torah, the text of the Torah, as well as the interpretation that Moshe got. But everything about Jewish law is found in the written text of the Torah, but not always explicitly. Often it has to be derived from allusions or drash or hermeneutics. And this is where this concept of hermeneutics comes in as a very important device to take words in the Torah, but to understand the oral law and where that hangs itself on the Torah, because it can't just be an interpretation that's got no foundation or basis in the text, although there are a number of such rules in the Torah that are absolutely without any foundation. Those are called halacha leMoshe b'Sinai, or a law that was given to Moses on Mount Sinai. It's not written in the Torah, but the most of what we call the oral law, most of the discussions in the Talmud are derived from text through this process of hermeneutics. Now, who gave us the rules for it? So there are a number of sources in the oral law for this concept of hermeneutics, but Rabbi Yishmael is the most famous, and the reason why he's most famous is because his 13 principles are listed in a baraita that is said as part of our prayers every single morning. In fact, the service in many shuls begin at that point with Rabbi Yishmael Omer, Bishlosh Eser Midot HaTorah Nidreshet. Rabbi Yishmael tells us that the Torah is expounded upon through 13 methods, 13 devices. It lists them, etc. And we should be able to get that in English. Yishmael tells us that the Torah can be expounded with 13 methods. So this is a good translation, because it doesn't baffle us with hard words here. So we'll go back to these. There are 13. I've only put 6 here. And you can see that just reading them without a bit of discussion and understanding is not going to get us very far. So we're going to go through some of them, not all, and if time allows for it, we'll do the first 6. It gets a bit more complicated as we go along, but let's see what we can derive. So number 1 is something called kal v'chomer. Kal is something light or lenient. Chomer is something serious or more severe. So it's a conclusion drawn from a minor or lenient law to a major or stricter one. I'll give you a simple example of the principle or the device of kal v'chomer. And of all 13 principles, this is probably the most logical and easiest to understand. Not easiest to understand, but most logical, in that it just makes absolute sense. So the rule of kal v'chomer goes as follows. I currently live about 150 meters from shul, and it takes me 2 minutes to get there. I used to live much further in Saxon world, where it took it was more closer to 1 kilometer. It took me at least as long to get to shul as it does now, because it's further. That's the principle of kal v'chomer. So if it's going to take me 2 minutes to get to shul when it's across the road, it's going to take me at least that long to get to shul if I live 1 kilometer away. How long? That's not kal v'chomer. That's for extrapolation, and kal v'chomer doesn't help you to start to extrapolate, but it lays the ground for saying that if a certain rule applies in a more lenient or easier or lighter situation, then that same principle will at least apply, maybe to a greater extent, in a more severe situation. And there are many points of halacha and of law that are derived from this principle of kal v'chomer. Now, the one I'm going to use as an illustration is a law we're quite familiar with, maybe a little bit morose, macabre, but it's the law of burying somebody as soon as possible, and if at all avoidable, not even letting a body wait until the next day for burial. It's a law that is applied as much as possible in South Africa, but of course we have a situation where often relatives are elsewhere. We have a situation where, in Israel, that is pretty much par for the course. Burials even take place late at night, which in this country is not legal. Burials after dark, but in Israel it is, and burials take place in the middle of the night to allow respect for the body. Now, where does that rule come from? It doesn't say anywhere in the Torah when somebody dies, you've got to bury them on the same day. Yet we know that it's a Torah law. Where does it come from? Where this is a law that is inferred by a principle of Kal Vachomer. And I take you to the Talmud. It's a Talmud in Sanhedrin. And the Talmud in Sanhedrin has the following discussion regarding this topic. Okay. So the Talmud is actually dealing with the law that when somebody has been executed by our Sanhedrin, by our courts, they are buried immediately. And even though often the body was hanging on the gallows, on a stick, but the body will be removed immediately and buried. And Rabbi says the following: when a man suffers in the wake of his sin, it says that divine presence says, I am distressed about my head, I'm distressed about my arm. In other words, the Shekinah, Hashem, suffers when the wicked are punished. And this is why we're not going to leave somebody who's been sentenced to death in indignity, but we're going to bury them right away. If God suffers such distress over the blood of the wicked that is spilled, even though they justly deserve their punishment, it can be inferred that he suffers distress over the blood of the righteous. So this is how we learn. Because the Torah talks about the mitzvah of burying somebody who's been executed by the Beth Din, by the Sanhedrin, on the day of their execution, we say, well, if God's distressed at the fact that this wicked criminal had to be executed because he committed a very heinous crime, and just to put it in perspective, executions on the Jewish law are extremely rare, and the onus of proof on the court in order to actually carry out a death sentence are very, 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 difficult and onerous. So it's very rare. And when that happens, it's because the crime has been committed in flagrant disregard for the laws of the Torah, and in total disregard for the warnings that the individual got, of the fact that there are witnesses who were seeing the act and that they're going to go and have warned this man, and they're going to go and report it. So we're talking about somebody who has absolutely no respect for Torah law, yet God says, I have a headache. My heart is pained from seeing this individual not being given correct dignity. So we say, well, if God's upset about the wicked, he's surely more upset about the righteous. And from there, we infer the law of speedy burial. So that is a principle, illustration of Kal Vachomer, following, but it's a principle that is used extensively throughout the Talmud to derive laws, such as a law here that does not feature anywhere in the Torah in writing, but once we understand the device of Kal Vachomer, we understand clearly where it comes from. Because Kal Vachomer is a logical inference, therefore, kind of, I want to say anybody can do it. You got to have a pretty solid grounding in Talmudic logic to be able to do it. But if you understand the logic of a Talmud, then you can apply this principle very, very, very widely. Then we have principle number 2. And principle number 2 is called Gezerah Shava. Now, how would we translate Gezerah Shava? An equal decree. But that wouldn't really do justice to what it is. So here's Gezerah Shava, and let's just have a look at how it is. Sorry, that's just the end of the section from the Talmud that I forgot to display earlier. So if you could have a quick look at that before we carry on. So here's the Gezerah Shava, a clarification based on identical words or terms in the biblical text. Basically, it means that if a word is used in one context and a word is used in another context, identical word, then that links the two principles or laws and compares them to one another. I'm going to have to give you an example. Okay, so here are 2 verses that utilize the same word, bemoado. Bemoado here in the context of Pesach, and bemoado here in a different context altogether. So here is the first one. It's about the Pesach offering. We just celebrated Pesach, then we had Pesach Sheni. Of course, now we had Shavuot. But Pesach, you have to offer a offering. And the Torah gives us this instruction of offering the Paschal lamb with the following words. The people of Israel must offer the Passover sacrifice at its set time, b'mo'ado. The question is, what happens if Erev Pesach is on Shabbat? Will the laws of the Korban Pesach set aside Shabbat, or will you offer the Pesach offering even on Shabbos? Or do you say, well, we're going to have to either bring it forward or postpone it? We can't really, in any way interfere with the sanctity of Shabbos because of a Pesach sacrifice, which is, we don't know. We have a Gezerah Shabbat, or right, a clarification based on identical words in terms of the biblical text. Here we go. B'mo'ado. Where else do we find the same identical word mo'ado? In the daily offering. There's a tamid offering that is brought every morning and every afternoon. And it's referred to here as korbani lachmi. Korbani lachmi would be my due food that is due to me. And that has to be brought every single day. It says be punctilious about it, presenting it to me at stated times. That's the b'mo'ado. And of course, the English doesn't go in order. So we say, well, if the daily offering, the korban tamid, has to be brought 7 days a week, and we're questioning here whether the Pesach sacrifice will be offered on Shabbos or not, this is the giveaway. The mo'ado link creates a bond between those two. Let me clarify. This is not something you can make up. The rabbis had a tradition of Gzerot Shavot, I think would be the plural, of cases where you could, because of words, sometimes the words are superfluous, and because of that, we know that they've been added simply to create that link between this word and that word, and to link the laws of Pesach with the laws of the daily offering. That is sometimes the case. Often the case, and those Gzerot Shavot are very powerful and difficult to refute. Sometimes they're not as powerful, but basically a Gzerah Shabbat has to have a tradition which has been handed down going back from Talmudic times, and sometimes there's debate as to whether the Gzerah Shabbat is accepted, and this has to do with whether there was actually a tradition that had been handed down from previous generations or not in that regard. So that has taken care of the first two of those principles. I'll take you to number three. Which one is number three? Number three is something called Binyan Av. Binyan Av does not mean a building put up by your father. Binyan Av means, and let's see how it's translated here in my text, a principle derived from biblical text. A principle derived from biblical text. Sometimes it comes from one verse, sometimes it comes from two verses. Obviously, a principle derived from a combination of two biblical texts is far more powerful than that which is derived from only one. And let me take you to the laws regarding slaughter of animals, shchita. And there's a very interesting law that states that when you slaughter an animal, the blood must be covered with dust. It's actually called kisui hadam, the covering of the blood out of respect for the blood. This applies to fowl, to birds that are slaughtered, and applies also to wild animals, to game when they're slaughtered. It doesn't to domesticated animals. We won't go into that detail now. So it says in the verse in Leviticus, he shall spill its blood and then cover it with dust. And says the Talmud, with that which he spilled, he shall cover. Now, how do you, slaughter an animal, say a chicken? Well, with your hands. You must therefore cover it with your hands, and you would not be allowed to use your foot, even though it's make a lot of sense. The blood's on the ground and your foot's by the ground, and you could simply take a bit of dust and kick it over with your foot. That is not allowed to be done. And that teaches us that mitzvot may not be contemptible to us. And therefore, this is actually a discussion in Talmud Shabbat about Hanukkah lights. From there, we learn that Hanukkah lights must be treated with respect, that mitzvot will not be contemptible to him. So from the principle that you need to do this mitzvah of covering the blood with your hands, we learn that you have to treat mitzvot with respect, and that is inferred and applies to, now there's no logic, there's no, it's just if the rule applies in one case, then unless you can explain to me what shouldn't apply in other cases, it doesn't. So treating a mitzvah with respect is very logical, that should be a rule across the the spectrum of Jewish law, and therefore it applies to everyone. As I said, sometimes such an inference or binyan av is taken from a combination of two verses, in which case it's far more powerful. Sometimes in the Torah we have a rule followed by detail, and sometimes we have a detail followed by a rule. Now, I can only illustrate once again with verses in the Torah and from the Talmud. So here it says that when you want to offer a sacrifice, it must be, okay, look carefully, if you present an offering of cattle, it must be from the herd or from the flock. Cattle, okay, that is behema, that is very wide. That implies that you could use any kind of animal. But then it restricts it by saying herd or flock only. From there we learn that it excludes kinds of animals that are not herd or flock. Herd would be, the oxen and the sheep, etc. From flock. Those are animals that can be used for sacrifices, but wild animals, as I said earlier, again, that cannot be used as a gift to Hashem. So that is a general rule: cattle, followed by the specific offering of herd and flock. So the specification is limiting in this case. But look at the opposite situation, where you have a specific illustration followed by a generalization. So here is the laws of the guardian. So you want somebody to look after your donkey or your ox or your sheep. So you give it to another party, you give it to your neighbor, you say, I'm going away for the weekend. Can you look after my animal? Now your animal happens to be a dog. Is that included in the rules that follow, which means that if it's injured or carried off, there's no witness about, etc., and the rules then become very specific in terms of what liability your neighbor has or not. So question, it doesn't mention dog, is it included? Well, yes. Why? Because we first have the specifics: ass, ox, sheep. Then after the specific, we have the generalization, any other animal. From there we say it's any animal. This would apply to any animal, not just the specific. So if this the animal in question was not one of these, it would still be included in the law. So let's go back now. We've got what's called the klal uprat, the rule followed by a detail. And then we get the detail followed by a rule. And we're going to, in the case of number 4, rule 4, we're going to say that the rule followed by a detail, the detail narrows the field. But in the case of a detail followed by a rule, the subsequent rule widens the application of that particular mitzvah. So here are the two examples. And then we have a situation sometimes where a rule is followed by a detail, and then the rule is repeated. And then you can only infer that which is similar to the detail. And again, that makes no sense until I show you an application. And this one takes us to the laws of tithes. Okay, so you have to give 10% of your, besides the 10% that goes to charity and that which is given to a Levi, there's something called Maaser Sheni, or the second tithe. That second tithe remains yours. You don't have to give it to anybody else, but you got to take it with you to Jerusalem when you go on pilgrimage and consume that food there. Not always practical, because if you are, a farmer with, a large harvest, now you take 10% of that. What are you going to do with the fruit that's going to get spoiled? And physically, to go into Yerushalayim with, wagon loads and wagon loads of 10% of total produce, that's just not practical. So you may exchange it for money. So you kind of exchange the value of that tithe fruit, that tithe produce, that tithe crop for cash. You go to Jerusalem, and there you buy, with that money, the things you're going to do in Jerusalem. And that's called, the redemption of Maaser, and then the opposite of redemption, the unredemption of Maaser, of the tithe. So how does the Torah describe this to us? The following verse. You take the money on anything you want, cattle, sheep, wine, or other intoxicant, anything you may desire. So what do we have? Anything you want, that's a general rule, what we call the klal. Then you have a prat, gives you specifics, cattle, sheep, wine, or other intoxicant. So if the verse had stopped there, we would say it's the rule of klal uprat. It's the rule of the general, followed by the specific. The only thing you can buy are cattle, sheep, wine, or any other intoxicant, beer, liquor, and so forth. That's not where the Torah ends. It's then regeneralized by saying anything you may desire. So it basically means you can spend it on anything you want, but then why does it give us this specification in the middle, cattle, sheep, water, or the intoxicant? It has to be food, consumable elements that are food related that you may buy with this tithe money. And that's why it gives us these specific examples in the middle, even though it's anything you want, but it's got to be things that are consumable food. They shall feast in the presence of Hashem and rejoice with your household. For the sake of completeness, I present to you also the remaining rules. And maybe as you read through them, you'll understand why we ended the shiur before it gets really, really complicated and involved, because rules 7, 8, and 9 are about rules and specifics, and they're not easy to understand. 10, 11, and 12 likewise are complicated rules and beyond the scope of this shiur, not only because of the limited time that we have. 13 is not particularly complicated. Two passages are contradict each other until a third passage reconciles them. So sometimes we have two contradictory verses in the Torah. We don't know how to understand them, but the third verse comes along and helps us to understand what are seemingly two contradictory verses. So those are the principles of Rabbi Yishmael, which I hope I have somewhat debunked and demystified for you. When you're sure when they read all these words, at least some of them will make sense to you and understand what they're really all about. I wish you a wonderful evening. Good night.